Greetings, Dr. Lotto. My name is Marisa Sanchez, and I am doing my presentation on observational learning in animals. The three articles I've chosen to talk about all have to do with observational learning, animals, and ask questions about conspecific models versus no model, meaning the demonstrators in each of these experiments were of the same species. So dogs were demonstrators for dogs, chickens for chickens, and the octopus for the octopus. The first article I want to discuss is observational learning in Octopus vulgare. The main question for this article was, what effect, if any, does observing a conspecific model have on the ability of an octopus to learn? Previous to this experiment, it was already known that octopus have the ability to change their behavior, but it was basically off of experience, so more of adapting to what's going on in their environment. What wasn't known was whether or not they would be able to learn from observing someone of their same species, because octopus are not social animals. It's not something we see in like the natural environment. So this experiment involved octopus choosing from either a red ball or a white ball. There were three phases to the experiment, and there were three groups. In the first phase, all the octopus were trained either to attack a white ball or a red ball, and the ball was the same size, the same shape. And in the observation phase, the observers watched either the group of demonstrators that chose the red ball or the ones that chose the white ball. And then, of course, the testing phase, the observers were then tested to see if they could replicate whatever it was that they observed. The results suggested that untrained octopus could learn from observing behavior of a conspecific, and that behavior would remain stable over time. There is also the finding that observational learning was significantly faster when observing a conspecific. So it took them longer to train the demonstrator octopus than it did for the observers to learn from watching. Some things to consider are the fact that they used a red ball and a white ball, and octopus are colorblind. So it was more of them like distinguishing from a darker shade to a lighter shade. And that might be why there was a larger error rate for observers of the white ball. Another limitation may be the fact that this data might not generalize. And in the future, it might be advantageous to replicate this kind of experiment with other species to see if it might help them in their natural environments. The second article I will be discussing is observational learning in Gaius domesticus with and without a conspecific model. And the main question for this specific experiment was, can birds learn through observation, and does a conspecific model enhance that learning? The previous research for this specific experiment was based on something it was based on a study done by Brown and Jenkins in 1968, and they discovered that birds had the ability to learn to peck a lighted key when it was preceded by food delivery. And they call this auto shaping because it was done automatically without any kind of like experimenter involvement. So this study is based off of that. It involved three phases: training, observation, and auto shaping test, and three groups: the stimulus group, the model group, the control group. So the first phase, all of the chickens were trained to eat from a hopper, and then they were assigned randomly to the three groups: stimulus, model, or control. The stimulus group They were exposed to the correlation between the key light and the grain. The model group were also exposed to that, but they were exposed to it through observing chickens demonstrating how to do it. And the control group, of course, observed nothing. The last phase involved all of the chickens being put together and being presented with the stimulus to see if they could replicate what they learned or figure it out on their own if they weren't exposed to anything. The results showed that birds are capable of learning through observation, and that learning is enhanced when they observe a conspecific model. There are some limitations into how this study was done compared to the one that they tried to replicate. They held the observer birds differently in this one. So moving forward, they should try to include that in their data and see if that changes anything. And they should also probably try to figure out if this behavior is something that will be consistent and last over time. The third and final article we will discuss is the conspecific observational learning by adult dogs in a training context. And the main question is, are there potential benefits of conspecific observational learning when training a dog? So previous research to this experiment showed that dogs are capable of learning certain tasks when they observe human demonstrators. And the research that had been done prior to this didn't show much correlation for whether or not they were able to learn from a conspecific demonstrator. So there was 3 phases: assessment, demonstration, and testing, and 2 groups. The first phase was the assessment phase. So the dogs were asked to do a simple task, either jump up on a slide or jump up on a trunk. And if the first time they were asked, they did it, then they weren't allowed to go further in the experiment. So basically, we had to make sure that they weren't already able to do what we wanted them to do. After that, they were split into 2 groups: a control group and observer group. The control group was held back. The observer group was taken on, and they watched one demonstrator dog perform the tasks when they were asked. And then the very last phase was the testing phase, where all the dogs were brought together again, just like in the first one, and they were asked to do the movement again and to see if they would be able to do it again if they had learned from simply observing. So the results were that conspecific observational learning in dog training is useful, and that they were more likely to repeat the behavior compared to a control group. And this points to the effectiveness of observational learning in dogs. And some of the limitations were probably that they only used one observer dog, and they probably should have used, I don't know, I think there should have been different observer dogs, maybe of a different age or a different breed. And that should be something that is tested when moving forward in the further research. It also showed, this study showed that all the dogs that failed to replicate were under the age of 2. And I think that moving forward, they should probably look into seeing what age has to do with whether or not they were able to learn. And that is the end of my presentation. And I thank you for watching.